Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to our August discussion session for our book, How to Heal Our Divides, compiled by Brian Elaine and Adam Thomas. And for those of you who are new, our discussion sessions take place on the first Thursday at noon Eastern every month. And so today our moderator is Lesa Englethaler, who will be speaking with Michael W. Waters. I'm Bethanie Baker Henderson, the coordinator for the discussion session, and we'll be speaking out of the first book, but know that there are two, but we're using this one today, and that's where Michael's contribution is. The second one, An Abundance of Opportunities, is also available. For our audience, if you have any questions, please put those in the chat, and I'd like to introduce you to Lesa. Lesa is a senior associate for the Victory Search Group, assisting nonprofits to recruit transformational executive leaders. Lesa is also a speaker and writer for such publications as the Dallas Morning News and Christianity Today. Her friends would say that Lesa is passionate about empowering women. Therefore, most recently, she's proud to serve on the board of Inc., a women's writing and speaking collective, the Economic Security Grants Review Committee for the Texas Women's Foundation, and she's also on the board of the Christian Community Development Association, which is actually one of the featured organizations in our book that we're speaking out of today. Previously, Lesa served on the board of Missio Alliance, and after leading an annual trip to Nicaragua for several years to partner with the House of Hope, a nonprofit that helps women escape prostitution, Lesa was delighted to join the board. Today, Lesa is working on her first children's book in hopes of empowering girls everywhere. Lesa earned a Bachelor of Science in Biblical Studies from Columbia International University. She's a native Texan and current resident of Dallas. Lesa has a chronic case of wanderlust and is wild about reading. Her favorite book is Jane Eyre. She's wild about live music and anything from the 1970s hippie era. Connect with Lesa on LinkedIn or on Twitter, and we share a mutual interest in children's books and nonprofits. But thank you for joining us today, Lesa. So good to see you.
Yeah, it's a joy. Yes, and I get to introduce my fellow Dallasite and brother, and really grateful. I wish that I was sitting in your office with you, Mike, and we were chatting together. That would be like in a perfect world. That would be amazing. But I wanted to introduce Dr. Waters to you, that's on the call. I like how you introduce yourself on Twitter. And so I'm going to read that for a short version. And then I want to brag about you in a longer version. So Mike says this about himself on Twitter: husband, father, pastor, author, professor, social commentator, freedom fighter. Amazing. It says it all, but I really liked that. And then here's a more formal one for you that are joining. This is going to be a treat today to hear from Dr. Waters. Is the founder and lead pastor of the Abundant Life AME Church in Dallas, Texas. He's appeared on major media broadcasts, including I think there's actually no one left off of this list, but maybe it's true. I don't know. Including ABC, BBC, CBS, MSNBC, NBC, NPR, PBS, and HBO, just to cover it all. He's also been featured on the Associated Press, the Chicago Tribune, the Christian Century, Ebony Magazine, Essence Magazine, GQ Magazine, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, Publisher Weekly, the Today Show, and the Washington Post. Waters' 5 nonfiction and children's books have garnered multiple national literary awards, and his leadership efforts have been formally commended by the White House, the United States House of Representatives, and the Texas Legislative Black Caucus, which honored him for an Outstanding Texan Award. He has been further honored with the Dallas Peace and Justice Center Peacemaker of the Year Award and SMU's Distinguished Alumni Emerging Leader Award. He's the co-founder and principal of My Water Consulting, LLC, which provides racial equity training and resources to corporations, congregations, and schools across the nation. I did not know that, and I want to learn more. A former chair of the City of Dallas's Martin Luther King Jr. Community Center, and a former co-chair of Faith Forward Dallas, Dr. Waters presently serves as the vice chair of Foot Soldiers Park and Education Center in Selma, Alabama, whose mission it is to preserve and memorialize the civil rights history of Selma and prepare the next generation of activists to continue the fight against racial injustice and voter suppression. A Democratic Fellowship of the Emerson Collective, Fellow of the Emerson Collective, Dr. Waters is researching storytelling as a pedagogy to encourage and strengthen civil action. Dr. Waters is married to Euless Reeves Water. They are the proud parents of 4 children, Jeremiah, Hope, Liberty, and Justice. I first learned, I always think this is interesting, about Mike through 2 means. I wanted to say this to you. Your award-winning first children's book is where I went, wait, this guy lives in Dallas? For beautiful Black boys who believe in a better world. What a title. And it's gorgeous. I say to the people that's listening, the gorgeous, provocative cover got my attention. It stays in your head, not to mention the message. I was looking for such a book and found that and found you. And then also, I just wanted to say, which made me smile, is that I knew about you first through your wife, Euless, who is herself an accomplished leader in Dallas, a former attorney. Euless is a former attorney for the city of Dallas, and today is the Chief Innovations Officer for Lone Star Justice Alliance, which mission is to redirect youth out of the Texas justice system back into the community. So what a pair the 2 of them are. We are ever grateful for you in our city and nationally. I know that your influence and reach is national. I know that as well. I want to let you speak. I want to say this to our audience, 4 things in our short time together today. I want to discuss your part of the book that, we're here for, and why you decided to contribute, and why this book. And then I want you to answer your discussion questions. We want to hear from you what you would answer to those questions. I want to be sure and ask you why you took the time to publish children's books. What is, you have a lot of things that you juggle. Why that? What? And I know that it's with a mission. And then lastly, Brene Brown, it ends all of her interviews with some fun, what she calls like rapid fire questions. And I thought that would be they're really fun to end it that way so that our audience gets to know you better. So that's what I want to do. Thank you for being with us. And we can jump right in. And I didn't know, Bethanie, if it's okay for me to say like a quick version of what the book is about first before we jump into Mike talking about his chapter, or is that assumed that everyone knows? I didn't know if people would be joining us just to hear Dr. Waters and don't know what the book is about. So it's up to you.
In any way you want to do the summary, either he can summarize or you can summarize, or however you like to do it.
The whole book is a project. I wanted to say this. Is not an attempt to gloss over serious problems, but instead to highlight tangible efforts that are solving problems, actually healing divides in an effective and practical way. That's what I loved about this book, is like it's featuring the people who are doing the things, doing the things to heal divides. So that's the purpose of the book. And I love how it ended in the intro. It said, we owe this to our children to try to make things better. I mean, hello, this is, so let's get started. Mike, I would love to know why would you are busy, to say the least. That was a shortened, even version of your bio. Why did you decide to contribute to this effort, this book?
Well, first, let me say what a delight it is to be with you on this day, and thank you for your kindness and for such a warm and gracious introduction. My wife is my hero, and so the fact that you connected with me through her is actually a delight for me. I am so excited about her work in the world. I think it's among the most important things happening within our community, and I'm always grateful to highlight it. Well, Brian provided an opportunity. We had met a few times in interviews for a couple of books, and he made mention to me that this new effort was coming forth, how to heal our divides, and asked if I would contribute to it. Of course, I was honored by the invitation, and then immediately began wondering what type of contribution that I could make. And when I think about healing our divides, and maybe it's just my own personal formation, I want to know more about the process. What is the end result in this regard? Sometimes I think when we talk about justice and matters of equity and equality, sometimes we want to press past the hard stuff to get to the warm fuzzy, right? We want to get to the healing portion without dealing with the necessities that bring about healing, right? Healing when you think about a medical sense, can be a challenging experience. You don't just rush to put on the band, right? There are things that need to be cleansed and spoken of. So I wanted to talk about really the depth of the divide, how deeply sown these things are, but also try to connect it to a legacy of resistance that in generations before, there have been persons who have arisen in their hour to fight back and push against oppression. And so really, that was the hope for my chapter in talking about how to heal our divides, to again connect it to the legacy of division, how deep that is within our country, and also to highlight the efforts before us that might encourage us in our work today.
Mm. So your chapter is titled Nothing New Under the Sun, Opposing Racism Today. I'd like to get you to, hopefully you have a copy of the book.
Sure, I do have one right here.
Okay.
Yeah.
I always love it when a person reads their own words. And so what I'd like you to do is read for us before we talk about your discussion questions, page 18.
All right.
And you can read whatever you want from your chapter, but this is the part that I thought might segue us in when it starts with the paragraph that says the author of Ecclesiastes opines.
Yeah, the author of Ecclesiastes opine, history merely repeats itself. It has all been done before. Nothing under the sun is truly new. Racism and racial oppression are not new, but just as they are not new, neither is our opposition to them. This truth is a well of hope. We have been gifted with a blueprint for transformative struggle. In multiple generations before us, we find persons who combated these evils with courage and consistency. Persons brave enough to bend the arc towards justice, knowing that it does not bend itself. Persons who bear witness to the light of God and the whole of humanity, and who work boldly against any force seeking to diminish that light. Coretta Scott King said, struggle is a never-ending process. Freedom is never really won. You earn it and win it in every generation. As in generations past, we must boldly, courageously, and consistently pick up the mantle of justice and advance the cause of freedom forward against this familiar foe. With faith in God and in community with each other, we will certainly prevail.
I wanted to, before we jump in with more questions, for us to pause and for if you, as a pastor, would pray for our time together, for all that is, if you would just, Mike, if you would just pray for our time together, then we'll jump in.
Let us pray. Eternal and gracious God, we are grateful for this space and time to spend together. We need not invite your presence because you are already here, but we acknowledge your presence among us and tell you that you are welcome. Open our hearts, open our eyes, open our ears to hear deeply what the Spirit is saying, that we might celebrate, protect, and defend the divinity within each one of us. It's our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you. I don't know about for y'all, but, the book was written in 2021, only a year ago, but it seems like light years away, doesn't it? I mean, I just think change, God, let's change, so much change. Ooh. The 4 discussion questions, I just like to hear from you, your answers on them, okay?
Sure.
So, and Bethany, I don't know if we can put those questions in the chat or if people can just refer to them in their books. It's up to you, but I'll read them out. So you'll have them right here. So if anyone else has answers or questions about the questions, they can jump in. So the first one is, if struggle is a never-ending process and freedom is never really won, why bother trying to change things? Mike, why bother trying to change things?
Well, I believe that we can have progress in each generation. And I think that tempers our participation, right? That we are currently the benefactors of the sacrifices made by those in previous generations. Certainly, they did not complete the work, but they did their work in their time and handed to us the best that they could, a better world. And then we have the opportunity now in our own generation to do the same. It reminds me of the Hebrews writer that talked about the work of faith and of these heroes of the faith and about the work in which they accomplished and yet did not see the fulfillment of that which they hoped for. And it then became an encouragement, if you will, for future generations to pick up that mantle and to advance it forward, right? So I don't think that we have the opportunity to be apathetic, to throw our hands up, and to act as though there's nothing to contribute. Nor should we be so overwhelmed by our times that we don't see the opportunity to bring about change. It's not hope if you already have it. Hope is confident expectation of what can become. And so when I think of, for instance, the abolitionists, they envisioned a world, a society free from the ills of chattel slavery while it was normative, while it was the order of the day. It would not have been enough for people to simply land in that better day if they were not committed to working and resisting in their own time to bring it to pass. Those courageous persons during the civil rights movement who envisioned a nation void of Jim Crow and segregation, they began speaking of that opportunity and working towards that opportunity again while it was the order of the day. They made such powerful statements as not being judged by the color of your skin, but by the content of your character. And in many ways, blazed a path forward that we're continuing to journey on now. So we understand that we are connected and woven into this ongoing legacy of work. And we understand that in each generation, we will be faced with challenges, but we should gain hope from the work of previous generations to work in our day to bring about change.
Needed that today. Thank you. Second question, is the call to action strong enough to motivate me to become part of the process of change?
I would hope that it would be. Here's what my reading of history tells me, unfortunately. What usually brings about significant and transformative change is traumatic and publicized death.
Mm.
And that is an unfortunate cycle, but it's one that has been visited upon us time and time again. You go back to Montgomery bus boycotts. A part of the history that is not spoken of as much as it should be, in my opinion, is that Rosa Parks, in her own testimony, said that while she was in that seat, refusing to vacate, she had the image of Emmett Till in her mind, right? That the brutalization of that young 14-year-old boy only about 3.5 months prior gave her the strength to remain in that seat. She said, this is enough, right? We see the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, unfortunately, because 4 girls are bombed into eternity. And we also want to remember the 2 other, which we often fail to recognize, young Black boys who also were killed on that same day in September 15th of 1963. We don't have the Voting Rights Act without Bloody Sunday, Jimmy Lee Jackson, the brutalities, James Redd, the brutalities of Viola Liuzzo, the brutalities that unfolded in Selma, right? We frankly don't have the Fair Housing Act and all of these other things that happened without the murder of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I would pray for a day where we simply take action because it's right to take it, right? And not because people are brutalized. And if we come to present day, right, we finally have a passage of a bill. I don't think it went far enough, but we do have some progress in terms of gun reform in this nation. But at what a great cost. 19 children and 2 teachers who were so brutalized by weapon of war that they were only identifiable by DNA tracing and the shoes that adorn their feet. So again, that's my prayer. That's my hope, is that action and the call to action and the need for action will be enough in and of itself to motivate our work. But unfortunately, for the wider populace, it usually takes some great shaking, the death of George Floyd, to grab our attention and to push us towards change.
Thank you. You state, oftentimes our divide results from a form of idol worship. What forms of idol worship do you see today?
The greatest form of idol worship that I see in the American experiment is the worship of whiteness, construct of whiteness, which is having damning effect, not just on white people, but upon all people. That social concept, that social construct, it doesn't exist in any biological form, but that we give so much weight to, that has shaped our society, has shaped our institutions, and even continues to shape our faith. And I think the greatest of those idols is the conception of Jesus as a white European. I think that's been the most problematic, in fact, most damaging image, in my opinion, in global history. Because what it in essence did was it was about creating God in your own image, creating the God who endorses your work to where your work and your voice is in fact the work and voice of God. And so as you are bringing millions in the child of slavery, as you are taking the lives of millions through a genocide and forced land removal, as you are commodifying race and sending it out all across the world, this image of the Christ as a white man champions and in fact supports and lauds your work. And so the image that most people have of Jesus is a myth. Most Christians, at least in the Western experiment, when they think of the Christ, they have him, they do not have a proper conception of who Christ is. I actually wrote a chapter for another book where I argue it was a book on preaching, and it's preaching about the border and about immigration. And I dare to say, and I think I'm pretty accurate in this assessment, that if Jesus were to come to our southern border, he'd be locked in a cage.
Of course, yes. Yeah.
that brown-skinned Palestinian Jew who would look more like our Central American brothers and sisters than the way he is normally presented. This man who himself was a refugee as a child fleeing the violence of empire. So many similarities to what's going on in many places across our world today. And yet in this nation where some people go so far as to promote as a Christian nation, I think there are clear evidence that it's not and was never intended to be. But those who make that bold statement that this is a Christian nation would not accept the Christ if Christ came himself in human form.
I want to pause here before we get to the last question of the discussion questions. And just to say, Bethanie, is there, or from the people that are listening in, do you have questions for Mike about the answers of those three, or questions yourself, or answers to the discussion questions? Is there anything there that you'd like to say? And you're on mute, so if you want to jump in, just I don't know if it's Bethanie that unmutes or you have to unmute yourself. So we'd love to hear from people listening in. Or Bethanie, you as well.
Yeah, they're muted right now, but I think they're personally have muted themselves. So if they feel comfortable putting things in the chat. You mentioned this. I did note that information that verse, that part that you said about the arc of justice does not bend itself. Do you think we're doing enough? Do you feel like we're making progress with all of the people? We're focused on this, but are we making progress, or are we just kind of talking and walking?
I think progress is being made. I think we have to measure progress beyond substantive change, right? That's the end goal. But part of the progress that's made is simply in capturing the minds of new persons and inviting them into movement. To me, that's progress. Okay. People who sat on the sidelines before that are now a part of the work, that's progress. People that are challenging the institutions and systems that they've long been a part of to do things in a better way. To me, that's progress. And so, you can get discouraged, and certainly understand why one would get discouraged if we don't see these substantive national, international changes, right? And if we totally rest in that change as a sign that things are moving forward, then that will be a very frustrating point of view. But if you actually look in communities, right, see people having conversations they've never had before, see people redesigning their boards to make sure that it's more reflective of the communities that they serve, people, frankly, dealing with budgetary matters to make sure that their investments follow their proclamations. To me, that's progress. And I see progress happening near and far, and prayerfully that will all coalesce to that ultimate substantial change that we all hope for and yearn for. The progress is happening every day all across this nation in very transformative ways. And it's important that we highlight and uplift those voices and that work, because I think it can serve as a encouragement to others. I say often that, movement is primarily local. That's where it begins. Mm-hmm. It begins in local communities. It begins amongst neighbors who say things can be better and begin working in partnership one with another. And then ultimately, usually, those neighborhoods and neighbors find other communities locally, regionally, statewide, and then you have something that builds and grows to become something far greater than it was when it first began. But those, as the scriptures say, that we should not disparage small beginnings. I think the same is true in terms of change and actionable change. We shouldn't look down or be discouraged by what appears to be small movements, because they have a way of growing.
Yeah, thank you for that, that ray of hopefulness. You also mentioned in your book about, we all are aware of the Christian nationalism, and we know that in the civil rights in the years past, the church was instrumental in making change. Do you feel that the church's role in Christianity in general has the same role as it did in the past, or is it a new path that we have to take now?
It's a great question. And it's one that I am exploring, maybe wrestling with now. I think that the latest data points tell us, and this is not new, this has been going on, frankly, since the 70s to present date, that we have few Americans who participate in religious community, faithful communities. Matter of fact, there are fewer people today who are a part of a religious institution, whether that be a church, a mosque, a synagogue. There are fewer people that are part than are not, right? So in essence, religious participation is no longer normative. It is normative. It's the exception to the rule. It's no longer the majority. So that's one frame in which to recognize it. And I think that, frankly, the coronavirus pandemic somewhat escalated some of these exits. So that is true. And that should be acknowledged. And that's happening across, again, faith traditions, across ethnic and racial groups, happening all across the country, right? I think it is challenging us, though, to reconsider what a faithful community looks like and how it operates. Is it simply those persons who gather between the time of 10 and 12 o'clock on a Sunday morning? Or are there new ways in which we are being called to be church or faithful to community and to bring about change? And so there's an amazing song a few years ago removed by Jay-Z and Kanye West that was called "There's No Church in the Wild." And I did a series of lectures where I challenged that notion, because I see church popping up in all type of places, right? It may not be the same ecclesia, right, that we are accustomed to talking about in terms of a formal religious tradition, but I see people gathering in faithful communities, inspired by their belief in God to bring about change. And the question, frankly, is whether or not faithful people who have been most comfortable in these religious spaces are willing to join them in the wild, right? But I have seen great acts of God and movement on street corners and rallies. One of the most moving and spiritual moments that I've had in my entire life was being arrested in Washington, D.C. For civil disobedience for the cause of justice. That was a moving and spiritual experience as we sang hymns, as we lifted our voices upon the pavement, as we willingly submitted ourselves to arrest. We weren't arrested. We submitted ourselves to that regard for standing up for the rights of our neighbors, rights that were paid for in blood. To me, that was church. And I enjoyed that experience. And frankly, I think the church would do well to be liberated from the pews, from four walls, and find opportunities to be present where others are gathered for the cause of justice, right? I'm not doing away with church as we have previously conceived of it. I'm a pastor. I think it has great value, but I think what has happened is we've assigned more value to institution than to people. And I think when we connect with people and are about centering the lives of people and their voices and their experiences and making it the order of the day in our work, I think we can then recapture, right, a spiritual fire in our churches. I say this all the time, but it's very important because, again, this is not a new thing. In Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, he talked about in April of 1963, that even then, every day, he was encountering young people who were outright disgusted with the church, who they thought was not doing enough for people. That being said, and this is a long answer, but this is the other part of it, I don't think that there's any other institution, particularly in the Black American experience, that has the history, the formation, and design to support and bring about systemic change than the Black church. And so that is a concern for me. And it's one of the things I'm working in terms of my research and work in the world now is how do we connect the two, this venerable institution that has had success in generations past in mobilizing and supporting and engaging people to bring about change. And the places where, frankly, young adults and young people are today who are really the energy behind movement, where they're working. How do we bridge the gap to make sure that they can form partnerships to bring about the change we need today?
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. We don't have any other questions. Lisa, if you want to continue. Oh, wait, we do.
Stephanie does. Yeah. Hi, Stephanie.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Stephanie Tucker. I'm just really appreciating all that you're sharing and, feel passionate about supporting all that we can to heal our divides. And Mike, I really appreciated what you shared in terms of, not seeing each other, for, who we are, our character. And instead, by the color of our skin and I also appreciated, what you were sharing about, what does it take to tip into action, and how can we get there without there being tragedy preceding it? And so I'm wondering on both of those topics, do you mind sharing your perspectives on what you think, would make a difference, both nationally, globally, in that shift and in seeing one another truly, as the beings that we are, the people that we are, and also tipping into action in a healthy way, and effectively.
I appreciate the question. And I think a lot of it from a biblical lens can be drilled down to the story of the Good Samaritan, right? Where you have a violent encounter on the road. You have a series of individuals who pass by and basically say, it's not my responsibility. And then you have one person who's invested, the least likely of the persons who pass by, who says, no, this person in their life, that is my responsibility. I'm willing to stop. I'm willing to provide aid. I'm willing to provide support. And not just in that moment, I'll return again and continue to provide support until such time as that person is healed. And that image really challenged the notion of who is my neighbor and what is my responsibility towards my neighbor. And if we have a healthy hermeneutic, we understand that to love God with our heart, soul, and mind, and our neighbor as ourselves is a fulfillment of all that is God and all that is right and all that is righteous in the world. A lot of the change that we need, frankly, would transpire at a very quick pace if we could simply acknowledge each other as neighbor and recognize not just that you're my neighbor, but that I'm compelled to love you with the same intensity with which I love God and the same intensity with which I love myself. I can't imagine that we would have childhood poverty and childhood hunger if every child was looked upon as your own. I cannot imagine that we would be satisfied with a criminal legal system that ensnarls bodies and removes them from families and communities for generations if we saw those persons who were incarcerated, frankly, many times because of some type of illness. Addiction is an illness, other things are illnesses, instead of getting the help that they need, they're placed into these institutions. If we look at those persons as our neighbors, our brothers, our sisters, not in need of separation from community, but in need of embrace by community, I don't think we would have bombs raining down on Ukraine right now if Russians looked at Ukrainians as neighbors and felt a call to love them as themselves, right? And so what usually facilitates historically this inability to recognize another person as our neighbor is the very nature of the division, right? Segregation allow people to dehumanize one another, which allows you then to enact all types of atrocities against them. And here's the amazing thing. You didn't ask the question, but I think it's very important. If you look at urban society today, the most impactful thing towards the design of urban communities continues to be the redlining of the 1930s. Over 75% of persons who live in redline communities continue to live in abject poverty. 91% of the persons who live in the green areas, or the areas that were considered the best, continue to be middle to upper middle class or higher. 85% of those communities continue to be white, right? So you can go back to this action that happened, motivated by racial hate in the 1930s, and you can bring it all the way up almost 100 years later, and you can say that this one action has done more to give shape to our divisions in our nation than any we've seen in the last 100 years. So the question is, what actions will we take now to remove those barriers and to draw people into community with each other again? I think a lot of the hatred that we see is simply because we don't know each other, and we allow the mythologies of media or medias to teach us some unfortunate things about one another.
So good.
Can I ask a question?
Sure. Hi, Joy.
Hi, I'm in Canada, and
Oh,
we've just had the Pope visiting,
Yes.
and Indigenous peoples here have been challenging him to go further than he did, as you've probably been reading in the media, and to repeal the doctrine of discovery.
Mhm.
Seems to me the doctrine of discovery and colonialism is really largely responsible for many of the divides that we're dealing with now. And what I'm hearing, and I'm very interested in this discussion, and I really appreciate what Mike has been saying. I guess what I'm hearing seems to be very American, because I'm a Canadian, right? It seems to be dealing with, and I mean, you have big divides, but in the States, I know, but we also have big divides. And I think every country has big divides, right? Many of them based on class, as well as race, as well as gender, et cetera, et cetera. So the divides, they differ, but I do feel that we have to look at the historical context too, and I'm sure you do that. That this whole idea that one race can go into another whole continent and just take all the resources, take the land, enslave people, has shaped our world. And I wondered if you had any comments on that.
Well, certainly, I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. In 2019, I believe it was September of 2019, I was invited to speak in Toronto. We did a series of talks in Toronto, particularly around the indigenous water crisis that so many indigenous nations in Canada face, some of whom have to drive 3 hours in one direction at least twice a week in order to capture fresh water to bring back to the places where they reside, right? Yeah, and again, our northern neighbor is oftentimes conceived to be more progressive than we ourselves, but we know, that there are incidences of police brutality and racism, and there's been divisions based upon language, French and English, and then you have the impact, of course, upon indigenous communities. And so I agree, there is suffering all across the world, and a good bit of that suffering, at least since the Enlightenment period, has been shaped by this social construct of race. And unfortunately, the monarchs and the aristocrats and the church were an unholy marriage in bringing that to pass. And we are wrestling with bad theology. And certainly the doctrine of discovery, or otherwise also known as manifest destiny, have created all type of atrocities, right? That image, there's that artistic presentation of manifest destiny that I was talking to someone recently, where you have a female angel who's flying westward, right? And you have indigenous persons who are fleeing. So one of the things I do, Lisa said at the very beginning, she didn't know about some of my work in race equity and the work of our LLC, My Waters Consulting. But one of the things that I do in teaching is to have artifacts and use them as tangible references of our history. And I have this in these things, items in ready reach. This pottery is actually ancient pottery. This is pottery of the Caddo people. The Caddo people that inhabited the region in which I live for nearly a millennia before they were forcefully removed, right? Unfortunately, we don't teach that history in our schools, right? But we have to acknowledge that we are on stolen land. Yeah. And there's a legacy that still impacts us because of that reality. You look at this is actual Confederate States of America money. And if you look at the corner, you see a indigenous person smoking a pipe, right? If you ever want to know what a country believes about itself, look at its currency. And in many ways, it will tell you that we uphold and we honor an American experiment, slave owners, because they are most prominently featured on our currency, right? And then when you look at the work of the Confederacy, you have some currency that has indigenous people, others that have Black people working in the fields. And what we're saying, it's like hidden in plain sight, is that we are a nation that was built on stolen bodies and stolen land. Yeah.
Well, when we were successful here in a campaign to get Viola Desmond, who was so-called the Canadian Rosa Parks, on our $10 bill, that was a great triumph for us.
Congratulations to you. And I tell you what, a part of the wrestling that we're having in our country, particularly with regards to Harriet Tubman and other individuals who they want to add to our currency, is do we actually want them? Mm. Is it actually an honor?
Yes.
Put them on our currency, given the state of our country and given the fact that they will share that space with persons who own their ancestors. We come up to this point. This is a old postcard from Six Flags over Texas. You see the top, it says Caddo War Canoes.
Yes.
Right? So now generations from having removed these people from their land, we find a way to commodify their experience, right? And we have, and literally in the same area where they were attacked by General Edward Tarrant in 1841, that same space later on as an amusement park, we have people going down with the Caddo War Canoes. Your question was about Canada, and I think that I think in many ways Canada is light years ahead of where we should be as a nation, and I greatly admire that. But I'm also very sensitive to the work that needs to continue, not only in Canada but all across the world.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Joy. Yeah.
Thank you, Joy.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, I'm gonna. This is so engaged, so good, to hear from Stephanie and Joy, and thank you for what you do, where you live. I agree with Mike as I say, walk across the street. This is my thing of that. If you don't know your neighbors, and if the pandemic didn't show us that, because all we had was our neighbors, I'm like, it's me and all the little boys that live on my street, and we become fishing buddies. I mean, we're buds, and so, walk across the street. I love that point. I wanted to say that for further reading from Mike, it talks about this in the book, and I loved how Brian and Bethanie gave so many resources. It's like a book of resources, but for further reading from Dr. Waters is his latest book called Something in the Water, a 21st century civil rights odyssey. So I would say to look up that book, and if you want to put that in the chat, or if you guys would see that, Something in the Water is the name of the title. And then which a friend and such a fan of which Brian McLaren says about the book, and he's one that does a chapter in this book. Every white Christian like me needs a Black pastor and teacher. In Reverend Dr. Michael Waters, I also get a prophet as well. I loved that review of that book. I would encourage you to read it. I want to make sure too, with our time, to ask you, this is kind of the third part, Mike, why you took the time to publish children's books. Okay. Bethanie and I know that is not an easy endeavor to even break into the market, and why that's important to you. And then I want you to read from your beautiful newest book, Liberty. But I want to ask first, why you did that. You have so much going on. People could say, oh, a little children's book, why? I want to hear from you why.
In April of 2017, it was April 29th to be exact, I was sitting in the pulpit of our church getting ready to preach, and had my phone not on my person but on the table beside me, and it began to buzz incessantly. It's over and over and over again, which is rare. Most people know that you're a pastor usually on Sunday mornings. They kind of give you some space. But over and over again, if it's buzzing, it buzzed for so long and so consistently that it demanded I pick it up. So in the middle of worship, I pick it up to see what's going on. Mm-hmm. And what had happened, and it actually had happened before, was that I was being tagged so frequently by so many people on social media that the notifications were going overboard. So I figured there's something that must have happened. I had a previous experience after I'd written the piece for the Huffington Post, and it gone viral when it first was released. But several months later, my phone began buzzing incessantly after a young boy by the name of Trayvon Martin had died, and it had gone viral once again. In this case, in April of 2017, a young boy by the name of Jordan Edwards had been killed by police in Balch Springs, near Dallas. And people were wanting me to know what had occurred so that I could be a part of the response to that tragedy. And certainly we were a part of the response. Our church hosted a citywide vigil, had national leaders from the NAACP who came in town, community leaders who were present. We met with the family. I actually was on the elevator with the parents of Jordan Edwards as we were riding to the top of the court building. I'll never forget when the threshold of the elevator opened, his mother sank to her knees and said, "I can't do this." Reminding me of Emmett Till's mother when she sank to her knees at the railroad in Chicago. We literally picked her up and walked with her to stand and demand justice. Well, one of the things I was asked to do was to speak at a vigil in honor of this 15-year-old boy who was shot by Roy Oliver. And my family happened to be there on this occasion, which is not unusual. Our family would be present at rallies. I thought it was important for our children to see what was taking place. But on particular, this rally, it impacted at the time my son, oldest son, in a very deep way. I was standing over with a group of individuals who were to speak that night, but I kept looking in his direction and I could tell that he was troubled. I invited him over to come and stand with me. I think the Associated Press ran with the photo of me basically leaning over him, kind of covering him in that moment. Got home that night, and my son, who has seen so much in his very young life, came into our bedroom before we were retiring at night and said, "Can I talk? I'm ready to talk." He said, "What's going on, son?" He said, "I'm tired of people hurting each other. I'm tired of people killing each other. I'm tired of people hating each other for the color of their skin. What can we do?" And we certainly talked with him in that moment, but about 2 weeks later, that conversation I was still wrestling with. And so on a flight to Los Angeles to speak at a conference, About mid-flight, I found myself with paper and pen and began writing down upon the paper our memories of the conversations through the years. And that resulted in For Beautiful Black Boys Who Believe in a Better World. That's a long way around to say I never aspired to be a children's book writer. It was nothing that was on my radar, nothing that I wanted to do, but the needs of my own children demanded such. And I soon found that these were the questions that other young people and families were wrestling with as well, and therefore it gave it an audience.
Thank you. I wanted you to read. This is Mike's most recent book. So beautiful, so beautiful. It's called Liberty's Civil Rights Road Trip. And Mike, I wanted you to read just from your favorite part of the book. Maybe a page would be amazing. And yeah.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I'm delighted. This book was recently featured by the National Civil Rights Museum for their Small But Mighty Storytime series. And I'll actually be in person at the museum later this month as part of the Ruby Bridges Reading Festival, reading and speaking and engaging young people about the book. One of my favorite portions is the final part of the book, beautiful art that was done by Nicole Tadgill. And all of this, the story builds up, if you will, to Selma and the bridge. That is ultimately where we're trying to arrive at, the ultimate place that Liberty wanted to see. And so I'll read from this page. It says this: the next day was the one Liberty had been waiting for. The bus rolled on and on. Finally, she shouted, "I see it. There's the bridge." "Yes, we're here," said Liberty's dad. "Welcome to Selma, Alabama." The bus stopped near one end of the bridge. As everyone got off, Liberty said, "Tell me why this bridge is important, Dad." Her dad smiled. "A long time ago, brave women, men, and children crossed this bridge as they marched from Selma to Montgomery. They wanted to send a message that the laws of Alabama should be the same as those across America, which said that every citizen could vote. Some marches were hurt by police officers who thought Black people shouldn't vote, but that didn't stop them. A few weeks later, they marched into Montgomery, 50 miles away. Black people can now vote in every state. This bridge is a symbol of everything people have faced to be seen as true Americans. It reminds us to be courageous as we work together to make our country better for all." Then he called out, "Let's march, everyone." Liberty and Abdullah grabbed the nearest hands as everyone began to cross together, just like the first marchers. As they walked, Liberty thought about all the places she had seen and the brave people she had heard about. Then she turned and looked behind her, just as she did that first day on the bus. So many people, all different, traveling together. Liberty's dad looked around and said, "This is what America looks like." Liberty wasn't quite sure what that meant, but she liked how it sounded.
Such a beautiful book. I know that we are out of time. I want to ask one to make it, not that we need lighter, but just for something fun. Brene Brown asks, and I'm asking you two questions that are fun, I think. Give us a concert you'll never forget.
Concert I'll never forget. Oh, wow. So when I was in high school, I took my then girlfriend out for a night on the town, and we went to see Brian McKnight in concert.
Oh.
That was wonderful, but I will never forget the opening act, who was just getting started and was creating a little buzz. In particular, their lead singer, who kind of shined very brightly in that moment. That group happened to be Destiny's Child, and that artist happened to be Beyonce.
Oh my God.
So
Wow.
to have seen that group in
Yes.
the earliest parts of their formation as they were opening up, right, for another artist, and seeing that young woman who you could just tell that something very unique about her gifting is a concert I won't soon forget.
That's a great, oh my gosh, I love that. Yeah, some fun questions. Thank you so much, Mike, Bethany, Brian, for this time, and our guest for joining us, your input. Blessings to the North, Joy in Canada. We wish we were there now, not just because of the heat, but because we do respect all things Canada. So yeah, it's true. Yeah. Thank you so much, Mike, and for all that you do. And thank you for joining us. Bethany, I'll turn it to you.
Well, I want to thank everyone for this incredible conversation. Thank you, Lesa. Thank you, Mike, and our guests. Thank you for sharing. Stephanie's gone, but Joy, and we really learned a lot. I think we could go on for another hour easily, obviously, but we ran out of questions and time. So I just want to thank you so much for your time and your attention, your participation. And I want to thank Brian for his book. Full disclosure, I did not write the book. I had no part in putting the book together, but I'm really happy to support the book. So Brian's done a great job with both books, and we're just so grateful that we can have these conversations, and hopefully this is helping also to heal these divides. I'd like to invite you to join us on September 1st at noon next month, when we'll speak with Angie Wright and Alexia Salvateria. And we'll have another great discussion. So thank you so much for your time. I hope you have a gorgeous day. Stay cool. Be blessed. Take care. So long.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you, Bethany. Thanks,
Bye.
Mike.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.